Now the
Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all this morning. I kind of dilly-dallied here for a few minutes, waiting for people to come in and giving myself a little burner time because I had yesterday evening to prepare a Bible class and a sermon for later on. So they're both going to be a little bit shorter than normal, unless I go off on an unprepared tangent like I sometimes do and get really long-winded. But I hope that that doesn't happen because I'm still not back to 100% strength after my sickness. So dealing with some stamina issues. But this is a really exciting chapter that we get to go into this morning, if I'm correct about where we are, because sometimes we get a little bit stacked up. I think we're in 1 Kings, right? Okay. Because I've been out for the past 2 weeks in my COVID situation. And so I was able to return to the public last Monday. So I worked all week, but this is the first Sunday morning that I've been here in 3 weeks. So I have no idea what has been discussed in the lead up to this chapter, but the exciting thing about this chapter is the introduction to Elijah and his time as the prophet of God in the northern kingdom of Israel primarily, which is really interesting because when we think of the lineage of the kings, when we think of Israel and the way God interacted, we often, after the division of the kingdom, we often think about the southern kingdom because that's where some of the good kings were. That is where the promised Messiah line was going to go through the tribe of Judah, which was, the primary tribe that remained there in the southern kingdom. But Elijah is primarily prophesying to the northern kingdom, where there were no good kings, not one. There had been, I had it written down here somewhere. I don't see it in my notes, but if I remember correctly, I think there had been 7 kings by the time Ahab arises, which is the time of Elijah here. All of them bad. In fact, increasingly bad. It's been about 58 years since the division of the kingdom. So 58 years since the northern and southern kingdoms were united under Solomon, because then Solomon's son Rehoboam makes very poor choices, and the kingdom is divided. And now it's been 58 years since that, when Ahab arises as king. 7 kings, progressively getting worse. And as we go into the introduction here to Elijah, I'd like to read a few things about Elijah, because he goes on to become one of the most, what we might call the legendary heroes of the faith in the scriptures. And so it's interesting in that so much of the focus of the line of the Messiah and so much of the biblical story that we remember about the Israelites post-division is focused around the southern kingdom, because the southern kingdom had some periods of good. God was merciful and long-suffering with them for a while longer. But Elijah, the great prophet, when we think of prophets that went to Israel, many people, both the Jews at Jesus' time and even today, we would often go right to Elijah. And he's the prophet of the northern kingdom. But if we go to the New Testament and read some of the stories that we in our time are so familiar with that reference Elijah, we could go to Matthew chapter 17. And here Jesus is in the middle of his ministry on earth, actually probably getting closer towards the end. And in verse 1 of chapter 17 of Matthew, we read, "And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah.' He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.' When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, 'Rise, and have no fear.' And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.' And the disciples asked him, 'Then why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?' He answered, 'Elijah does come, and he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands.' Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So Elijah appears with Moses and is immediately recognized by the disciples. The disciples know these men, Moses and Elijah. These are 2 of the largest figures in the Jewish stories. Moses was a fairly popular leader at the time. He went through several problems where the people, wanted to kill him. But for the most part, Moses, from the time that he rose up, was a popular and revered figure within the Jewish nation. Elijah, not so much. Elijah, as we're going to see as we go through the story of Elijah over the coming weeks, he kind of stood alone for much of his ministry. And he was not all that popular. Many of the people in Israel would probably have been happy to see him go away. And yet he becomes someone that the Jewish people look back to as one of the great men of faith. And that's important because of the mission that he was sent on and the message that he was supposed to deliver, and the importance that it holds in the understanding of the Jewish nation from then on about idolatry. As the story of Elijah grew, and over time, as the people of Israel were sent into exile and then came back, and by the time of Christ, they're holding on to the story of Elijah as one of the great symbols that God is, and there is no other. And even though the Jewish nation rejected the Messiah for the most part, and God judged the Jewish nation in AD 70, as he prophesied that he would, they did not deal with idolatry again after the final exile. And that is a crucial mission of Elijah, is to stand alone and challenge the gods of the time. And to begin that deep understanding in the nation of Israel that there is only one God. There is no other. And his life is one of the most dramatic testaments to that all the world could see. So it's an exciting story to take up. But the disciples reference the prophecy that Elijah must come before the Christ. And that's another important element of the story of Elijah, in that his message and his power was going to be sent back to Israel symbolically before the coming of the Messiah. And I think it's important to try to understand how Elijah and John the Baptist are tied together. And that's not really a study for this time because we need to get into 1 Kings. But as we go through the story of Elijah, realizing that God points to this man and his ministry and says, I will again send Elijah to prepare the people for my coming. And a lot of it is tied to that message of the one true God and his power, and of challenging the power structures of the time, challenging the false ideas of the time. When John the Baptist arrived on the scene, the Jewish nation was not in idolatry as far as it goes to worshiping the Baals or the Asheroth or graven images. But John the Baptist has to challenge, much like Elijah did, directly, powerfully, confrontationally, the hypocrisy, the idolatry of the time. And their stories are very intertwined. And it's important to recognize that as we're looking back with a broad scope, or we're looking back at the big picture of the symbolism, what Elijah was meant to do, what his purpose was, how he became such a larger than life character in the understanding of the Jewish nation, and then everything that God was doing through John the Baptist to prepare the Jewish nation for the coming of the Messiah. Malachi chapter 4 or 5. If we go over there real quick, that's one of the places where this is prophesied. There's a number of places, but in this final 2 verses of the Old Testament, the prophecy is, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. And I think that's a crucial verse too, in that Malachi, the prophet Malachi, is reminding the people of Israel he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. And that's not something that we really think of when we think of the prophecies of Elijah. And it's not really something that we think of when we think of John the Baptist. But it's a crucial element. And I think we're going to kind of see a little bit of why that is in the story of Elijah, the turning of the hearts of the fathers to their children. And then finally, let's go over to James chapter 5. James is discussing prayer and the importance of prayer. In verse 16, he says, "Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working." Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. A man like us, just a man who was trying to make his way in the nation of Israel. And God called him. And we're going to see struggle. We're going to see discouragement. We're going to see depression and questioning, everything that makes us what we are in this world. Elijah is a man like us. To the Jews of the first century, he had become one of the most legendary heroes of the faith. But that's not how it started. He was hated, and at his pivotal moment, he stood alone. And that deeply affected and troubled him. It was not easy to be alone. A man of faith, he was, but it was hard to stand alone. So let's start by backing up just a little bit and reading in 1 Kings chapter 16. The rise of Ahab as king of Israel. It's interesting, back here in verse 25 of chapter 16, we read that King Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did more evil than all who were before him. And then we come down to verse 29. In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab, the son of Omri, began to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned over Israel and Samaria for 22 years. And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. So Omri is so wicked that the scripture says he did more evil than all who were before him. These increasingly wicked kings, and Omri outdid them all. And then Ahab comes and he one-ups his father by doing more evil than all who were before him. And so just in these couple verses, we get such a strong sense of the moral collapse of the Israelite nation. It's unbelievable over a period of several generations. Now, remember, this didn't happen overnight. Again, when Ahab rises, it's been 58 years since the division of the kingdom. So those days of David and Solomon are quite a long time back now. You think about our nation and what can happen in 58 years in America. We remembered the events of 9/11 yesterday, 20 years ago. It's amazing, those of us who've been around for that entire period of time, how much our nation has changed in 20 years. And so this is a period of 58 years, and the nation, the northern kingdom of Israel, has become increasingly wicked at a dizzying pace. But I think it's easy for us to understand that when we can see in our own nation how fast society can change. So Ahab, you go on to read. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria, and Ahab made an Ashereth. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. In his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. So Ahab marries this Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. Now the Phoenician people that were on the coast, Tyre and Sidon were their great cities. They were great maritime traders, and this alliance would have been very politically advantageous. So it's not necessarily for any qualities of Jezebel. It's probably for political opportunity and for the alliance that would exist that Ahab marries this Jezebel. But Jezebel is strong of will and Ahab is weak. And very quickly Ahab begins going along with everything that she wants to do. I mean, she is running the show. And she, as we know just by the name, what the connotations are of that name, one of the most wicked people in the scriptures, a very powerful, very strong woman. But she used that strength and that influence that she had for tremendous evil. Ahab made an attempt because of Jezebel and her desire to bring the worship of Baal through the land, to stamp out the worship of the true God of Israel altogether during his time as king. Jezebel desired that the prophets of God and righteous people who still held true to his worship, that they would be slaughtered. Now Baal, which Jezebel worshipped and brought the worship into the nation of Israel, was a deity worshipped by many of the Canaanite peoples before the Israelites took the promised land. So they've been struggling with this Baal worship that surrounds them for a long time. But it was very regionalized, the way that the Baals were worshipped, because Baal was generally regarded as the god of fertility. And so they would, the Canaanite peoples and the Phoenicians and others in that area that worshipped the Baals, they would look to Baal for blessings like offspring and good crops and fertile livestock. And even a prominent thing in the worship of Baal was the rain, the seasonal rains. The seasonal rains were attributed to his goodwill. Now, different regions had different variations of the Baal that they worshipped. So there were many, as we read through historical accounts, we always see Baal, but it's often hyphenated because there would be a regional understanding of Baal. So there would be Baal Peor, Baal, whatever. And the Baal of Tyre, which is the Baal that Jezebel worshipped and is bringing this worship into the nation of Israel as queen, is Baal Melkart. And this worship consisted of burnt offerings and the use of incense among all the people. But it was much darker among the fervent worshipers and among the cult priests of Baal Melkart, because human sacrifice was an important component of this worship, as was deviant sexual rituals that they would perform in worship of this god. And so as Ahab gets caught up in this, and by extension the nation of Israel, as Jezebel brings all of these prophets in and makes this the dominant worship in Israel, it's the terrible things that are going on. Children being offered up in sacrifice to this god, all manner of evil, despicable acts committed in his worship. And it's really interesting to think about the people of this time Because most people in Israel, I'm sure, are not fervent worshipers of Baal. But as that becomes the dominant religion, and as that becomes what everyone around them is doing, that just conditions the people. We understand how that happens. We see the effects of culture around us. We see the effects, as this is accepted or this is accepted, and then it's, taught in the public school systems or all throughout the media, and a generation just accepts it without question. And then it progresses to the next phase with the next generation. And this Baal worship just becomes accepted and a part of life in Israel. And just to get along and just to be what you have to be a good citizen. The millions and millions of people who still should have had some memory of the days of David and the God of David, and the God of Solomon. Now they're bowing the knee to Baal. Because that's what the society is doing. That's what Jezebel is instituting, and she's the strong-willed one. She's the one with the power. She's the one that drives society. And Elijah is called by God to challenge this. And because he challenges it confrontationally, directly, most of the culture is going to view him as a troublemaker. He's going to be awkward. And, with everyone in Israel bowing the knee to Baal and praying for the blessing that he will give, and then the seasonal rains come. And Elijah comes and challenges that and stops the rain. And, most people are going to say, whatever was going on was working. I know you don't like what was going on, but hey, now people are dying. It's not going to be taken very well. But he is sent for the purpose to cry out against this decadence, this moral collapse, this drift of society, to be a voice raging against the evil that is rising. Verses 1-7. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. After a while the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. This is harsh. And like I was explaining, you can imagine the ordinary people of Israel being furious at what's going on. If they've come to accept and be conditioned by the worship of Baal, even if they're not really into it, even if they're kind of agnostic, it's like we go through these rituals and the rain comes. This works. And then Elijah is coming up and raging against what's going on in society, causing an uproar, and now there's no more rain. What are you doing, man? Why don't you just go along with what's working here? The thing is, the prophets of Baal looked to Baal for rain. And this drought is going to cause people to die. And that's a consequence of such moral decay in society, because sin, even when it's gone along with passively, is devastating. There were children in the nation of Israel being burned at this time because of this evil worship. And the ordinary person just going along may say, this is working. Why are we upsetting this? But God is just. And even if society has forgotten that, God is just. And the evil that is happening in the land is rising up to him. And he closes the windows of heaven until the people are so parched that they will realize completely that the prophets of Baal can cry out for rain day and night for years and offer sacrifices every day, and it's not going to do anything because the rain will only answer the word of the one man that's standing out in the wilderness calling upon the name of the God of Abraham. And that's how important it is that the people of the nation see this, understand this. This drought is going to be devastating. In the next section, we kind of get a story that illustrates how deadly and horrible this is. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there." Now, the reason he's having to leave where he was is because the brook has dried up. The land is so parched now, there is no water. And God tells him to go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon. So remember, Tyre and Sidon, those are the great cities of the Phoenicians. That's where Jezebel comes from. And so Elijah is not going into a stronghold of the worship of the God of Israel. He's going into one of the most permeated regions of this false worship. Zarephath of Sidon. But God says, "I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink." And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." She immediately recognizes who he is. He calls and asks her for a little water, and without question, she goes to get it. And I love that little image that we have here, because at this time, water would have been so precious, but she still has water. She goes to get that. And she recognizes, we don't know how the word of the Lord came to her, but he says, "I have commanded a widow to take care of you." And she immediately recognizes this as the man. So without question, she goes to get some of her precious water for Elijah. And then he asks her for food. And she spills out the truth about her situation. "I have nothing left but a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil. And I'm gathering these sticks to go home and prepare it for the last meal for me and my son. And then we're going to starve." Because there's nothing left for her. She's exhausted every resource, and there is no one left to go to. And yet, she's going according to the word of the Lord. Even this widow in this land that would be permeated completely by the worship of Baal, and she receives the word of the Lord, recognizes this as the man of God, and goes to do as is said. And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward, make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord. that he spoke to Elijah. And so by telling her, go and prepare a cake first for me, and then what's remaining for your son. As a desperate mother with nothing left but a little bit of food, and her son that depends on her, and they know they're going to starve. Can you imagine how hard it would be to give the first portion of all that's left to a stranger? Elijah says, go and prepare a cake for me first, and then go and prepare what's left for you and your son. But I tell you by the word of the Lord that as you're preparing that jar of flour will not go empty, and the jug of oil that you're using will not run dry. And the widow goes and does it, and brings the food to Elijah. And when she returns to her house, no matter how much flour she pours out, no matter how much oil she pours out, it never runs dry. And so God providentially reaches in. He calls this widow, knowing her faith and her ability, even though she's at the end of the line. And she does. And her house is spared from this starvation. The last page of notes. Not with me. But we're almost out of time. So 17 through the end of the chapter. This continues the story of Elijah staying with this woman. And after this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. Elijah prays, and this boy is raised to life. And this is a private thing. This happens very quietly in the house of this widow. This is one of the greatest miracles. To come back from the dead. Our entire faith hinges on our belief that Jesus Christ beat death and came back from the dead. And our hope, our confidence is that through that belief, believing that Jesus could rise from the dead, that he has the power to do the same for us. So that we, as our bodies decay and fall apart, and every one of us is headed for the grave, we have the belief that our Lord, our Savior, our Master will come back for us and raise us from the dead just like him, so that we can be with him incorruptible forever. To rise from the dead is no small thing. It's not something that we see. And Elijah is so deeply affected and hurt for this widow, this woman that in faith is taking care of him, that he cries out for something impossible. And God listens to him. And the importance here is that this story was written down, and this story is going to spread. And even though Elijah is unpopular and hated at the time, and we're going to see in the coming chapters the ultimate showdown. It's going to be so exciting between Elijah standing alone and the prophets of Baal. We're going to see Elijah being hunted, rejected, hated by the people. Jezebel is going to promise that he will die, and he's going to go through trials. He's going to go through discouragement, questioning. He's almost going to give up entirely. But these stories of his faith are going to spread throughout Israel. And over time, this understanding is going to be ingrained in the people of Israel, especially as they look back at Elijah. That Baal failed to even send rain, which is his job, and he could not even consume a sacrifice being offered up to him by his own prophets. And yet the God of Abraham can give life back to dead people. So the story of Elijah is so much more than what's happening right in this moment. Because those stories are going to spread. It's going to affect the nation of Israel, and all the way down to today. We read about this one man standing alone. And what a powerful story of faith it is. So much to gather, so much to understand. Are there any questions or comments about chapter 17? All right. Thank you for going through the story with me. Let's close our class and begin our worship.